us a presentation. We look forward to it. Glad you're here, Adam. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity and, always enjoy the opportunity to talk about turkeys. And I can talk about it all day long, so I'm gonna try to keep this as brief as possible. Before I kick this off, I do, for you gentlemen, I do wanna say, I appreciate y'all's patience on this issue. What I'm going to talk about today is really not specific in any way, but more just a big picture. As often as I can, I let people know that I'm very proud Mississippi turkey hunter. I think we're a blue chip state in the turkey hunting world. There's a reason why you see so many name brands within the hunting industry that all have Mississippi ties, and I think we should be really proud of our past in terms of turkey management, turkey research, the things that this agency has done in the past, the things that Mississippi State has done with turkeys, and we're lucky that all of that has allowed our state to be widely recognized for turkey hunting. So I'm probably really biased in that view, but I very much feel like Mississippi is important in the turkey world. What I'm talking about here today is not just about regulations themselves. It's really about a big picture view of where we're going with turkey management here in the state. And this process really began all the way back in 2015, initially with the state chapter of the MDWFP sort of deciding that they really wanted to lobby hard for some different management changes. And then that's also about the time frame where we as a staff began putting together our comprehensive wild turkey management plan. I'm going to, at the back side of this presentation, offer some recommendations, but it's worth noting that these are not, quote, formal recommendations, that we typically don't make those formal wildlife recommendations until April. So you can kind of view these as this is where our staff is and where we think we need to go, but this is, a part of a continuing dialogue about all of this. So my presentation itself is basically kind of going to be divided into 4 parts. The first part kind of go over just a little bit of the context of how we got to this moment to talk about turkey regulations and what we're going to do as a state. Kind of review with you gentlemen what we have done to take that big picture look. You're aware of some of those components, but just want to hit them all again. Some of what we've learned from all that, the findings from some of the research stuff, some of the opinion survey stuff we've got, and then in the final part, our set of recommendations on where we think we need to be going here. So, to kick it all off, part 1, how did we get here? I've shown this figure to you guys before, I think, in some past presentations, but this is basically our estimated turkey harvest along with our estimated number of total turkey hunters. So the graph you're looking at, the red bars, are the total number or the estimated total of turkeys going all the way back to 1962 through the 2022 spring season. The little blue circles are the total number of estimated hunters that we have. You'll see that from the 60s through the 80s, our total harvest grew exponentially. That's partly because turkey populations were rapidly expanding after restocking. That's also partly because as they were expanding, the state was opening up different zones. We didn't just all of a sudden allow turkey hunting from Corinth to the coast all at once. That happened in phases. So the total harvest is going up through that whole time period. Our total harvest peaked in the late 1980s, and it also peaked at a time when hunter numbers peaked about that same time, or kind of the first peak. You'll see we're on the cusp of another peak right now. So the important thing to note is that our turkey harvest dropped really dramatically from the late 1980s to the early to mid-1990s. It leveled off for a period during the 90s, and it dropped again in the early 2000s, and really since about 2004 or 5, somewhere in that era, it's been fairly flat. You see some fluctuations from year to year, but overall it's been fairly flat. Meanwhile, the number of total turkey hunters has increased dramatically. You see, if we just go back to 2010, we were sitting at right around 30,000 turkey hunters in the state. That number's essentially doubled since 2010. So now we're at about 60,000 total turkey hunters in Mississippi, which is on par with what we saw in the late 1980s, but we have not seen a corresponding increase in harvest. So we've got a higher user demand on a resource that's not growing. The reason it's not growing, we got a lot of good data on turkeys, but this just illustrates kind of what I'm pointing out here. Every summer we do a brood survey looking at turkey reproduction. That's the figure that would be on your left. up there. Poults per hen is the indice that we really pull out of that. And you'll see we've got data on that going all the way back to 1995, and that has been declining essentially since the mid-90s. And so when turkey reproduction declines, the number of turkeys decline. I will point out to you that 2022 number, the last figure on the right-hand side of that graph, we had a tremendous hatch this past summer. That poult per hen number was 2.3 statewide, which is about 40% above what the long-term average has been, and by far the best hatch in my 15 years working for MDWFP, and really rivals some of the best hatches we've ever had on record over the last 30 years that we've been recording that data. So bottom line, there's a lot more turkeys in the woods right now today in February of 2023 than there probably have been in the last 20 years because of this hatch. It was statewide. Every region of the state did really, really well. I've been hearing that feedback all deer season, people seeing turkeys in places they haven't seen them in a while. So hopefully this is maybe a trend.
Nobody knows why.
Mystery of the universe. I think there's a lot of reasons why. If we could figure out the why, we could solve a lot of these problems. But I think we had really good weather last spring, and that probably helped out a lot. But why it jumped as high as it did, I'm not exactly sure. But suffice it to say, the data suggests we had just a whale of a turkey hatch. There's a lot more birds in the wood right now. So I'm more optimistic today than I probably have been in the last 10 years. But the long-term trend on our brood data is negative. It is a declining trend.
Adam, help me with that. Poults per hen.
Okay, so what we...
Is that survival? I mean,
So
you
what
know
we
they
did
have
in
8
that
to
survey
10.
period from June to August, we've got people recording all the turkeys they're seeing. And it's basically just a ratio of the big ones to the little ones. So we look at all the hens that are seen during that survey period and all the poults that are seen during that survey period, and that gives you a ratio. So 2.3, but that ratio generally needs to be about 1.8 or above to see the numbers go up. So some years we get that and the turkey numbers go up. Some years we don't and the turkey numbers are going to go down. So 2.3 is well above the number or the threshold we would want to see increased population.
Oh, I'm confused. I know they have 8 or 10.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're saying, over half of them don't make it?
Yeah, but that number is across all of them. So some hens don't have any,
Okay,
right?
it's
Some
got all-
hens are going to completely
Okay,
lose
okay.
all of them or not have a nest
Because I
at
know,
all.
on my observation, that the hens, if they have 10 or 12
Yeah.
or 8,
Right, I see what you're saying. And
2/3
that's
of
correct.
them will survive.
That's correct. Usually the
So, but
ones
this
that
is all the hens.
right.
Okay.
Usually the ones that do have poults are going to have, it averages about 5
Yeah.
per group. Now some of them are more than that, some of them are less than that. But you got to account for the ones that are losing their poults too. So that's where that number comes from. But most every state in the country does this same survey and uses this same number, and we've kind of standardized stuff so we can compare Mississippi's data to, Kansas or whatever.
If one hen had 8 and they all survived, another hen didn't have any, then all of a sudden that number
Right,
cuts it down.
right. So in that case, the number would be, what, 1.4, right? Is that
Okay.
right?
All right,
Or 4, it'd be 4, it'd be divided.
that's what it meant, because
Yeah.
I look at them a lot. I saw a bunch of them yesterday.
Right, but that brood number correlates really well with some of our other stuff. So this other chart up here is the number of turkeys per 100 hours in the woods hunters are seeing from a survey, our spring gobbler hunting survey. So they're recording when I started hunting, when I stopped hunting, how many turkeys I heard, how many turkeys I saw. Those two data sets usually correlate really well with one another. But the point of this is to show that even in the observations over the essentially 30-year period since the mid-90s, that's it's a slight declining trend. Okay, so there's reason to believe we have fewer turkeys today than we did 30 years ago. That's part of the reason why all of this concern and why people want to address this turkey issue. The other thing, and again, kind of painting the full backstory why we're here today, in 2016, the Seattle Wild Turkey Working Group, which is basically a collection of biologists from all the southeastern states, they published a white paper on how state agencies should think about, or what they should think about when they're setting spring hunting seasons. This came about because there were some, not here, but some other states were getting a lot of push at the time to liberalize opportunity, and the thought was there needs to be something that folks like yourself who are setting policy can take and read to figure out what are all the things that need to be going into how you decide a season framework? Essentially, there's three factors that really come out that this white paper identifies. The first is hunter satisfaction, and that really goes back to hearing gobbling activity, timing your season when the turkeys are gobbling. That's what hunters want to hear. There's two biological factors that states should consider. One is illegal hen kill. This is essentially, hens are not legal to be shot in the springtime, but they either are accidentally or intentionally being killed. There's a significant amount of research that shows that is a problem in places that have long traditional fall, either sex seasons. It's never been shown to be a problem in the deep south like Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia. So the white paper basically says this is a well-documented phenomenon, but it's not a widespread phenomenon. It only takes place in some places but not others. And it's important in the timing of the season because as hens begin nesting, they become more secretive, more solitary, and they're really not out there for hunters to interact with as they would be. So some states set their season late to avoid this illegal hen kill. But the paper recognizes that that's not an issue for every state. Some states don't have this problem. We've never seen this problem here in Mississippi.
I've never heard,
Yeah.
no.
The other biological thing to think about is the potential impact of gobblers being killed really early in the breeding season. So a state like Mississippi falls into this category where we're essentially taking out males almost a full month before the hens begin nesting in a lot of cases. And so it's hypothesized that that could cause problems. Obviously, at the extreme, if you killed every single male before the hens begin nesting, you wouldn't have any nesting. But that's not the reality. You know, the truth is somewhere in the middle. But it's been hypothesized that this could be a problem. The document recognizes that this is something to think about, but it also notes that while this is hypothetically possible, it's never really been documented or tested or investigated. A number of states, those states in the red are the ones that I'm aware of, and I may have missed some, over the last, let's just say, decade or so, a number of states have changed their spring season regulations specifically to address this notion that turkey populations are declining. Different changes have been different things in those states, but the point is that there is a lot of concern about turkey populations across the country, and you see a hole in that map where Mississippi has not really addressed anything with our spring season up till now. And because of that, that's, you know, hunters are aware of this, they're aware of what Georgia's doing, they're aware of what Tennessee's doing, and they say, well, what are we doing? Well, we've been doing things, we just haven't yet made a change formally. The upshot of all of that is in that comprehensive wild turkey management plan that we drafted, you know, one of the strategies that it had listed in there was to critically evaluate the statewide spring season structure and make changes if necessary. So our approach from the beginning has been, we're not going to make a knee-jerk reaction here. We want to look at all facets of this and then come to a conclusion after we've evaluated all the data. The commission, you gentlemen formally adopted that document in the 2017, I think it was the February meeting in 2017. Another thing to think about, in addition to the spring season itself, is you know, we have a problem with outlaws in Mississippi, apparently. We did in 2017, we did a hunter opinion survey, asking a bunch of questions about turkey season. One of the questions that we asked in that survey was, during the 2017 spring season, did you directly witness or receive firsthand confessions of hunting violations that pertain to wild turkeys? You see the pie chart there, it shows the response. Basically, about 1 in 5 people said they had firsthand knowledge of a turkey violation during that hunting season, and that's out of a sample size of about 5,000 people. So if you look at what the follow-up question to that was, well, what was the violation that you're aware of? By far, harvesting over the bag limit was what people reported they had some firsthand knowledge of somebody doing. So if you know, put that in raw numbers, that means about 15% or so of Mississippi's turkey hunters are aware that somebody shot over the bag limit. So that, you know, insinuates that we have an issue there that should be addressed. Because of that, also within the wild turkey management plan, you know, we have one line item in there that we need to adopt methods to effectively enforce the turkey bag limit as a result. So one last thing in this kind of first part of the context of how we got to where we got. It's just a look back at sort of how Mississippi's seasons came to where they're at presently, okay? So this is not completely exhaustive, but it's just kind of a quick hitter of high points of our season structures over the years. As best I've been able to tell through our historic records, we have had a 3-bird bag limit in Mississippi since 1967. Now there's a little bit of nuance in that because, like I said, during that era in the 60s and 70s, we were opening zones in certain places. And at that time, there were county-specific bag limits and frameworks in place before we got to a full statewide season. But if you look at essentially the areas that were liberal and wide open at that time, we went to a 3-bird bag limit in the spring in 1967. And prior to 1980, the framework, as far as the start date and the length of hunting, it bounced around a lot. And like I said, it even had, some years where you would have very widely varying frameworks across the state, some places being one thing, other places being another thing. But essentially by 1980, we settled on a set spring season framework that was in place all the way until 2004. That framework was the season started the Saturday closest to March the 20th, and it ran through May the 1st. In 1998, we prohibited adults from shooting jakes, from shooting a turkey with a 6-inch beard or less. We were the first state in the country to do that. And to date, only one other state has endorsed any form of that, Arkansas. In 2000, we added a youth weekend. In 2005, we extended that youth weekend all the way to a full youth week. And then in 2005, we switched the spring season framework to begin on March the 15th, regardless of the day of the week it fell on, and run through May the 1st. So that's kind of, and basically we've been in that framework ever since. On the fall season not really traditional or popular in most of the Deep South. Mississippi's no different from that. The Mississippi River Levee Clubs have had a fall season going back at least as far as the early 1960s, but up until 2006, it only existed behind the levee and the Batcher on those clubs. In 2006, the agency undertook an experimental expansion of that and basically opened a fall season in 2 different zones in the state. I'll show you a map of that here in a minute. One in the northeast, one in the southwest. That season is really limited, runs from October 15th to November 15th. It's on private lands only, but it isn't either sex season. So hens can be shot legally in the fall for privates that participate. So that's kind of a backstory how we got to where we're at today. So now part 2 of this presentation. What have we been doing to look at all this? Well, a big piece and something we appreciate the commission doing was endorsing a harvest reporting system in 2019. So Game Check started in 2019. We've had it in place, was that 4, 5 full seasons now. It gave us a lot of information we didn't have prior to this, but one of the big pieces that's important to understand in kind of the impact of the season structure was looking at harvest distribution by day of the season. That's an important piece, but we didn't really have good information on that prior to Game Check. The second thing that happened in 2019, we implemented some experimental changes on a subset of our WMAs. So, like I said, that white paper that I mentioned earlier says that if you're like Mississippi and open really early in the breeding season, you should be worried about the impact of gobble harvest. So we decided we'll take a look at that by moving the season framework later on a subset of our WMAs. Each of those had a paired control that we kept the long original statewide season so we can compare and contrast, what happens across those. And then we monitored what happened with the turkeys through hunter observations. Hunters who are on those WMAs are telling us how many turkeys they're seeing and hearing and shooting and all those sort of things. So that was another step in us trying to evaluate our spring season structure. And then the big piece that we hired Dr. Moran to help us with was basically a forecast model. In official academic terms, we would call this a 2-sex, 2-stage stochastic demographic turkey model. You can just think of it as a forecast, a way of using real data to try to predict what would happen in the future.
What's the word stochastic? What does that mean?
That just means that it includes the variability that you would actually see in nature. So it's bouncing. The model recognizes that some years you get a really big hatch like we had last year, some years you get a really terrible hatch like we had in 2013, and it's accounting for that variability in the thing. And I'm gonna tell you real quick, if you want very much specifics on that, I'm gonna refer to Dr. Moran, because she knows a lot more about this subject than I do. But bottom line is, the way the model was built included real data. The data was taken from almost 200 studies that had been done on turkey populations across the range of the eastern wild turkey. So all the things like survival, reproduction, nest success, all that stuff was coming from those. It included our harvest data from here in Mississippi, from Game Check, from our spring gobbler hunting survey, those sort of things. So the harvest information was real data coming from us. And then it allowed the manipulation of kind of one factor about harvest and then predict what would happen, knowing all these other things that are bouncing around, as they will in nature, what's going to happen on the back end. And so that was another step in us trying to evaluate what would happen with the spring season. There was another piece in all of this. I've told you before, we have a spring gobbler hunting survey that hunters collect information for us. Been doing this since 1995. Annually, we mail this survey to about 1,200 people. They tell us, I went hunting on March 15th and I hunted for 6 hours and I heard 3 gobblers and that sort of stuff. But we've done a couple of other pieces of work, working with MSU to look at the effect of past season changes, specifically that 2005 change. And then we've also been able to use this information to look at things like, do the tools that hunters use make a difference? Because some states have banned decoys, for instance, because they think that's contributing to turkey decline. They making it easier for hunters to kill turkeys is somehow contributing to things. So we've included stuff like that, look at that. And then each year in that survey, we ask hunters, how satisfied are you with the season? And because they're giving us their data on what they're hearing and seeing and doing, we can relate that satisfaction back to what they're experiencing on the ground, how many turkeys they're killing, how many they're hearing, that kind of stuff. All right. So part 3, what do we learn from all this? Much to my disbelief in the beginning, I honestly thought moving the WMAs back to April 1st was going to make a big difference, but it has not. Dr. Moran has done a very defensible analysis called a before-after control impact design. It's legit and will be peer-reviewed and publishable and all that sort of thing, but essentially it shows that these WMAs, when you compare the WMAs that got the April 1 season to the WMAs that stayed at the normal statewide season, there's no difference in the trends, in the number of turkeys hunters are seeing, the number of turkeys they're harvesting, the Jake observation, so the first year males, we thought that would be an indication of whether reproduction has increased on these WMAs. There's no difference there. So bottom line, that real world case study is showing us that changing the season on those WMAs did not have a measurable impact in the 4 years since we've done it. So not only did we shift the season back, as a way to kind of address this question of this killing gobblers too early in the breeding season matter, that's also effectively a 40% reduction in total opportunity to hunt on those WMAs, the ones that went to April 1. So moving the season back 2 weeks and reducing the season by 40% didn't make a difference in the number of turkeys before and after. The model results, and again, I'm not a computer modeler myself, so I got to have things, in real simplistic terms to be able to try to understand. What you're looking at in that table is basically the different scenarios that Dr. Moran and her team tried under the model, how that would affect the harvest rate. So the harvest rate is the proportion of the adult gobblers that are getting killed under each scenario. And then that last column is basically the model output. It runs a 10-year simulation to say what would the turkey population be 10 years into the future, and we standardize that by the size of an average Mississippi county to make that a real, kind of more of a palatable number to think about. Bottom line, nothing about the model forecast suggests that changing the spring season alters the population trajectory of turkeys. In other words, the number of turkeys is going to go up and it's going to go down irregardless of what you do to the spring season. The changing the spring season does not make that change, that up and down that you're going to see in the turkey population change, which is essentially what we saw with the WMAs, right? We didn't see any change in the WMAs, even though we made a pretty big change to the framework there. This model supports that. The changes to the spring season, if you look at it in terms of the number of turkeys, real world number of turkeys, it's pretty minimal. I mean, you look at, you know, basically in that red box I have up there are the scenarios that were investigated that, you know, might be things that this commission could change. So if you look at going to a 2-bird bag limit, so taking 1 bird out of the bag limit, that drops the harvest rate by about 3%. But at the end of 10 years, you know, you're looking at about a dozen more birds per county that adds back. So very minimal. Now, I doubt many hunters would notice a dozen birds added back to the county. And essentially all of those scenarios, like one of the bottoms or further down the list there, reduce the season by 2 weeks, so that's shorten the season by 2 weeks, and drop the bag limit all the way down to 1 bird. So a combination of those two things, it drops the harvest rate down to 19%. So it cuts the number of turkeys we're killing almost completely in half. But at the end of 10 years, that difference is only a few dozen birds to the average Mississippi county. So a huge cut in terms of harvest, but a very minimal result in terms of the number of turkeys back to the landscape. And just to kind of really drive the point home, one of the scenarios that Dr. Moore ran was the complete closure of the spring season. Not that we would ever recommend that, that's obviously not politically palatable to do that, but just to illustrate the most extreme you could possibly do with the spring season would be to take it off the table. So harvest rate goes to completely zero, and that still would only add, you know, about 125 turkeys back to the average Mississippi county. On the flip side, if you change parameters in the model that are associated with reproduction or with hens, it has a much larger impact, okay? So just increasing reproduction by 2%, which is one of those scenarios, the second from the bottom scenario. So we're still killing the same exact number of gobblers, the same proportion of gobblers are getting killed, but increasing reproduction by a mere 2% has a bigger effect than anything you could do with the spring season. So if we find a way to make hens 2% more successful, it pays bigger dividends than anything we could do. And it actually increases the population trajectory. Most of the model simulations show the population goes up if you do that. Likewise, increasing hen survival over the fall and winter by a mere 2% has a huge impact on the number of turkeys forecasted 10 years from now. So one way to think about it, the difference between going from a 1-bird bag limit, a 3-bird bag limit to a 2-bird bag limit in the spring, the impact of increasing hen survival by 2% is 30 times greater than that. So the model is essentially saying there's not a whole lot we can do on the spring side that really makes a difference in terms of number of turkeys. But if we can find a way to help hens out, you know, that pays huge dividends. So while the number of turkeys is not necessarily affected by the spring season, there are some other things to think about. One of we have put a couple of papers in the National Wild Turkey Symposium in the last 2 issues. One of those showed that the change from 2005, or the 2005 change to March 15th, caused harvest per unit effort, or harvest per unit effort decreased by about 15%. So it essentially took longer for people to kill turkeys because of that one change. And I'll show you a graph here in a second on gobbling activity that really illustrates why that is. But basically, during mid-March, a week's difference makes a lot of difference in terms of turkey behavior. So going from what we used to be Saturday closest to the 20th to the 15th moved most of the hunting effort into a time period when the turkeys were not gobbling as good. If they're not gobbling as good, hunters are not going to encounter them as often. If they don't encounter them as often, it takes them longer to try to kill a turkey. The number of turkeys didn't change, but it made it harder for hunters to kill a turkey just making that one shift. We found that decoy use by hunters in that survey didn't really impact harvest per unit effort. So again, a couple of states have suggested those as changes, but we found that nothing there, it really would make a difference. And then finally, if you look at satisfaction from the people in that spring gobbler hunter survey, their satisfaction has nothing to do with the number of times they go hunting. The people who respond and say, I'm really, really happy with turkey season, and the people who respond and say, I'm really, really unhappy with turkey season, go turkey hunting about the same number of times. But the difference is the people who say they're really, really happy kill a lot more turkeys. They kill about 80% more turkeys than the people who are unhappy. So the point is not that this is, rocket science. Killing a lot of turkeys makes people happy. The people who kill more turkeys tend to be happier and more satisfied with our spring season. All right, so where do we go from here? Again, several recommendations we'd like to bring up. The first, we feel it is time here in Mississippi to implement a mandatory tagging system. Our law enforcement officers have made a lot of really big turkey cases over the last couple of years. The Operation Longbeard down in South Mississippi got a lot of attention, got some national awards, but there's been others. If you'll remember that opinion data that I showed earlier, about 1 in 5 people say they know of somebody who's violating the bag limit or something to that effect. So it's clear that we likely have an issue here in Mississippi. Our game check reported harvest, legally game check reported harvest, runs about 40% of what our estimated harvest is. So even with game check, we're not getting full compliance with that law. The only way to get compliance is going to go to some kind of a tagging system. Most states, many states have some form of a tagging system, and it's there to provide our officers with a tool to enforce the bag limit. So our view is that before we really do any kind of dramatic changes to legal harvest, we need to be sure we are minimizing the illegal harvest to the greatest extent possible, that we're doing everything we possibly can do. And let me give you just one talking point to really drive that home. Operation Longbeard that the guys down in Southwest Mississippi busted. If you take just one county out of that group, so Lincoln County was the county that those violators had the most illegally killed turkeys in. They killed just that one group of, a handful of people killed 21 illegal turkeys in Lincoln County. If you look at our estimate of the number of people that killed 3 turkeys and put that to the average county in Mississippi, the average county in Mississippi only kills about that same number of legal third birds. So in other words, the illegal kill from that one group of people is on par with the number of legally killed third birds from legal hunters. Tagging has been strongly supported by hunters every time we've surveyed for it. We've got a lot of opinion survey data on this, and I don't think we've ever gotten less than about 2 to 1 in favor. The last time we've ran surveys on this, it's running more like 60-some% in support of going to some kind of tagging system. So we think if we're talking about big picture, what can we do to help turkey management in the state, this is a top priority for us. Currently, the commission has full authority to implement tagging for wild turkey. You don't have that authority for white-tailed deer, but you do have it for wild turkey. Secondarily, we suggest implementation of a wild turkey stamp. This would be dedicated funding for wild turkey research and management in the state. This is not something the commission could do, but we see it as a high priority thing. This would take legislative action. Last year when we held the Turkey Summit, it was one of the top things that came out of that discussion with a room full of people. It too, just like tagging, is supported in our opinion polling, and a number of states already do this. Just next door to us, Louisiana has a turkey stamp, Texas has a upland game bird stamp, Florida, Arkansas has implemented a voluntary one that's just on a voluntary basis, garnering them several $100,000 a year that they're using for turkey stuff. So we see this as a really high priority. And this is just my opinion, the most important thing that stamp would do, more so than the dollars it would raise, is that it would annually, from now until forever, would make the commission and the agency and everyone who's involved with turkeys annually take stock of what needs to be done. So if you're gonna, just like with duck stamp, if the money's tied to waterfowl, you gotta use it for waterfowl, which means you gotta be thinking about waterfowl annually. And I see the real benefit of a turkey stamp being the exact same thing. It means every year we gotta come to the table and sit down and figure out what are the high priorities. It could also offset the cost of a tagging program if there's a processing fee associated with tags. So those two things kind of go hand in hand with one another. And it would allow us to be able to identify specifically who's turkey hunting. Right now, people buy a sportsman's license. We don't know if they're deer hunting, turkey hunting, whatever. We recommend sticking with the 3-bird bag limit, primarily because of all the scenarios that Dr. Moore modeled, it was the least impactful. Going from a 3-bird to 2-bird bag limit does not pay dividends that would be noticeable to most people. The liberal bag limit is traditional for Mississippi. Like I said, we've had it since 1967. And we see that hunter satisfaction is highly tied to how many turkeys they kill. So allowing them to continue on with kind of that tradition of getting 3 will add into hunter satisfaction. We are suggesting considering going back to the pre-2005 spring framework. Now, as Dr. Moore's model showed, not a whole lot we can do with the spring framework that's going to change the number of turkeys, but there are some hunting quality and hunter satisfaction issues that we definitely feel like this would address. So on the one hand, if we go back to that 2005 framework, I'll show you here in a second, it moves the start of our season back to a time when turkeys are gobbling better. It would also increase the frequency hunters are killing turkeys, not because there's more turkeys, but because if they're gobbling better, they're going to encounter them more. So we can show with data that it'll increase harvest per unit of effort just from that. It takes it back to kind of a familiar Saturday opener. Most of our big game seasons either open on a Saturday or a holiday when people are off from work, so that's familiar with people. The last 2 years, March 15th has fallen on a Monday and Tuesday respectively, and that causes confusion in the public. If we do this, we'd still have one of the most liberal seasons in the Southeast. So I'll show you in a second, it is a slight reduction in total days, but we're still going to have more total days of turkey hunting than anybody else. And as a bonus, this would realign our youth week with spring break. Most of the schools in the state, for reasons that I don't know, have moved their spring break back a week in the last 3 or 4 years. And so our current youth season no longer completely overlaps with spring break when the kids are out. So this is what I'm talking about on the gobbling activity. That chart right there is showing gobbling activity as measured by our hunters in our spring gobbler hunting survey. The figure on the left, the dotted line, shows you where we're currently starting. So we right now are starting on March 15th at a time when gobbling is pretty low. If you just hold the season off 1 week, gobbling activity increases about 40% just in that 1 week. And so the scenario on the right is what we would be proposing going to March the 20th. Essentially, the turkey season would be starting right at when gobbling activity is ramped up pretty high. There's regional differences in the state. Obviously, the south part of the state, they start a little bit earlier than the north part of the state. But, if we went any later than this, I think we would get significant kickback from people in the south. But the current way it's set, as early as it is, we every year hear a lot of negative feedback from people in the north because they know turkeys aren't really gobbling when we currently open. The effect that this would have on the season, these are just some calendars to show you kind of, if you go to this Saturday opener like we were in 2005, it does cause the season start date to fluctuate. It can be as early as March the 17th or as late as March the 23rd. If it were in place this year, we would be opening on March the 18th. We would have a 45-day season, regular season, and a 7-day youth season. Next year will be under that variable framework. Next year would be as late as it possibly could fall on the calendar. So next year in 2024, the season under that scenario would be March 23rd, and it'd be a 40-day regular season, a 7-day youth season. 2029 would be when it reverted back to as early as it could possibly be. So March the 17th, 46-day regular season, 7-day youth season. And this is just a comparison how we would stack up against everybody else in the South. So just to be clear, if we went back to that pre-2005 framework, it would be a reduction in days, and that would vary depending on how the calendar fell. On the low end, it would be a 2-day reduction over what we're currently at. On the high end, it would be an 8-day reduction over where we're currently at. But if you take the average of that scenario, Mississippi would still have a longer season or more total turkey hunting opportunity than anybody else in the Southeast under the average of that, knowing though that the total days would fluctuate a little bit one way or the other based on how Saturday fell. The final piece we're recommending is to suspend the current fall season. As I said, it's a very limited opportunity currently. Those red counties are where it's currently open. So it's open essentially in the Bachelor, a collection of counties in southwest Mississippi, and a collection of counties in the north. The justifications for doing that is that Dr. Moore's model showed that increasing hen survival is one of the single most important things you could do for a turkey population. This fall season allows hens to be harvested, and given the concerns that we hear from hunters about declining populations, and given that the model results show such a huge outsized impact of increasing hen survival, we feel that it's really an indefensible policy at this point to allow either sex harvest in the fall. Most turkey hunters in Mississippi are not strong proponents of a fall season anyway. We had opinion survey data on this back in the day that really showed only about a third of the people wanted a fall season. And the way it's set up now with the zones, it causes confusion. Every year when we do our postseason responsive management survey, usually, this is an example. Last year, 13 of the top 15 counties for fall turkey hunting were not even in open zones. And the only way I can rationalize that, I would not think people would knowingly confess to violating the law. I think they are simply seeing those dates like in our outdoor digest, and they don't think anything about it. They don't read the fine print, and they just go hunting. So anyway, for all of those reasons, we're suggesting suspending the current fall season. We would be open to exploring maybe a gobblers only opportunity if we had tagging. Our view is that a gobbler that would be taken in the fall is essentially a gobbler that's not available in the spring. So if you had a true tagging system where that fall gobbler could count against that person's spring bag limit, that would be something we would be open to exploring. But right now, we don't really have the system in place to be able to do that effectively. And again, I think public support of this would be something we would need to revisit. All right, so I'll wrap it up. In summary, the demand for turkey hunting in Mississippi is increasing. We're seeing a huge increase in hunters, but our turkey population is not increasing. Illegal exploitation of the turkey resource is a pretty big problem in our state, and we should try to address that if we can. Changes to the spring season have minimal effect on turkey populations based on the research that we've done, but they can affect some things that are associated more with hunter satisfaction or hunt quality. And then finally, to improve turkey numbers, we can't really look at the male harvest side of the equation. We have to look at the hens, have to look at increase in reproduction, increase in hen survival, those sort of things. And just to wrap up kind of our suggestions there, we recommend trying to implement a tagging program. We've met with law enforcement. They are 100% behind that. We recommend having some sort of dedicated source of funding for wild turkey research and management. We would recommend retaining the current spring bag limit, considering returning to the old spring framework, primarily for hunt quality reasons, and then suspending the fall season at present. And that's all I got.
So this would be something that we acting on the next couple of months before the, for the 23 season.
So,
23 season.
right now, as I said in the beginning, this presentation is just sort of the continuation of a conversation.
Right.
This is not formal recommendations. Those would come in April when we traditionally give the wildlife recommendations. That's when, you know, if you gentlemen are in agreement to endorse these things, that's when we would present, you know, the actual rule changes in written law and that sort of thing. But we know that, you know, with turkey season coming, you're going to be getting a lot of questions about what are we doing. We're going to be getting a lot of questions about what are we doing. So we thought now would be a good time to have this conversation to kind of make sure everybody's on the same page. I will say that nobody from the state chapter of the MDWFP is here today. Almost all of their officers are headed to Nashville. The convention is starting today. But we've had this discussion with them, and their full board of directors voted overwhelmingly in favor for all of those pieces. So we have the full support of the state chapter of the MDWFP. And they provided a letter to Mr. Posey expressing their support for each piece of this package.
I'll tell you something I did on my place that made a difference in the harvest. My first cutting of hay, I waited till July the 1st. Because earlier when I was trying to get my hay cut first, you know, when it all got to do with when it's gonna rain or not rain or whatever, ain't no telling how many turkey nests cutting hay that we tore up. And I waited till July the 1st for the last several years, and I've had the best turkey hatch than, I mean, they're everywhere in my place.
I can believe it.
It made a
To
difference.
back you up on that, University of Tennessee has a big study going on in central Tennessee, over a multi-county area south of Nashville right now. And they have seen 12% of their nest losses have come from haying and mowing.
Well, it don't
Which
matter
is, to
about
me,
it.
that's a shocking number that, like you say, if you knew all you gotta do is park the tractor for another month, and you can increase nest success by 12%, that's a pretty easy fix right there.
I mean, I hadn't counted them, obviously, but I know there's a lot more of them out there when I've waited till July.
Yeah, we've seen it happen. So along those lines, you know, talked about whether you want to have a north season and a south season, and what you've said, and maybe Dr. Martin could comment on this too, but the nesting is not a dramatic difference between the southern part of the state and the northern part of the state.
That's right.
Because Tennessee, as we know, the season starts later and goes into May, in the northern part of the state. And so along these lines, what we could do, along with doing this hypothetically, what you're talking about, we also have recommendations, more forceful or not more PR or whatever about, you know, cutting and hay later. So my question for you is, what he was asking, when do you recommend people not bush hog and cut? When would they? When was it sort of safe to do that? 'Cause
When I get that question, Commissioner Costner's date's the date I usually throw out, July 1st. Most of the nesting is gonna happen from about mid-April to about mid-May, but there's still hens nesting all the way through kind of middle of June. So if you wanna, hedge your bets, July 1st is a good safe date.
That's true north and south?
Right, there's about a 10-day to 2-week difference in gobbling activity north to south in our state, but there's not really a lot of evidence that the actual nesting varies all that much, so it's probably, fairly standard.
Well, that made a difference.
So second thing is our lottery for out-of-state, drawing for out-of-state hunters coming in. We know, because other states have moved their seasons back, we're still getting inundated. I think you had about 1,000 spots.
1,100 as well.
1,100, you had about 1,100 applicants last year, correct?
And that actually closed while we've been in here, so today was the last, 10 o'clock today was the last day for them to apply.
My point is, if this recommendation were to happen and the season moved back to the first Saturday, then that first 2 weeks for out-of-state drawing on public land,
Right.
that would, if we kept that in place, that would go back a few days too.
Potentially.
Potentially. So that would be good in a way, because that might put those out-of-state people where it'd be more in line with, they put them into April before they could hunt Mississippi, would be more in line with other states. So maybe
That's correct.
maybe they'd be more inclined to go to, of course, Alabama's they're like March 27th or whatever they are, something like that. 26th.
So even though that shift, if we went back to the old framework, it would be a little later for us. That's still gonna make us way earlier than nearly everybody
It
else.
But also, for out-of-staters coming in, it would push them back a little bit before they could hunt public lands here. So it might take a little pressure off the public land.
Correct.
They're still gonna come when they can, if they want to.
Yeah, I think we're still gonna be a popular early season destination for out-of-state people either way.
Dr. Moore, is anything you would add? I mean, Adam said a lot, but
You got the definition of stochastic.
stochastic, yeah.
No,
You tell us about stochastic now.
No, I will say, Mr. Koza, I'm really excited to hear you say that about the effect of moving back when you were doing the mowing, because that just validates the model results, right? Like it's one story, but I'm not surprised to hear it, but I'm delighted to hear it. So, yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions related to it, but no, Adam did a really nice job presenting all the results.
And we know the biologist's view on trapping is that unless you do it on a landscape scale, it's hard to affect scientifically the population.
Right.
But it can have some success.
And we certainly encourage recreational trapping, unless I'm badly mistaken. Right now, we're already providing the maximum amount of statutory trapping opportunity that we have in statute to provide. So our trapping season is already basically maxed out.
So for hen survival, there's some correlation there, and certainly for nest predators, they have an effect, we know.
I will say that on the model, there's one piece in there where we talk about reproductive output, and I'm in the process of breaking that out so we can get a better idea of what's going to be more important. But some of that's going to take a little more research too, which some other states are doing. But is it the amount of brood sites that are available? Is it more habitat that'll give a better, a better idea of exactly how to address that. But overall, yeah, trapping, I actually am a predator ecologist, not a turkey biologist. And so, it has to occur at the landscape scale to really have any long-term effect, or even just within a couple of weeks effect on survival. And then the other thing is that if the habitat still isn't managed correctly, it's not going to have any effect. So it's got to be the habitat first, and then trapping might give you a little extra boost on top of that, but not if the habitat's not there in the first place.
Yeah,
Habitat's key.
Let me tack on to what she said, just to, she reminded me, I meant to say this in presentation. So the results of her work that I showed, we're still ongoing in a lot of ways. It's not been peer reviewed and published and all that sort of stuff. And so there's still stuff we're learning. And there are other research projects going on around the South right now. This question about the impact of turkey seasons is a pretty hot topic for a lot of people. So there's some other things going on in some other states that we're going to keep an eye on that, depending on how those results fall, may, down the road change our view on things. So right now we're just, giving you based on what we know today, the information that we've got available today, this is what we're thinking where we're going to land.
So we met with the Tennessee Commission. I was the only one who was able to go, except for Lynn, Larry, but their commission made changes even over and above the biologist's recommendation. And one of those was encouraging trapping more. Then they moved the seasons back, partly because of this anecdotal research on early harvest of gobblers, and which we all know about. The point being is it's just put pressure on us as a state. So thank you for all your research, and Dr. Mooring for your work on it.
Thank y'all, Adam, appreciate it. We got a commission meeting in 5 minutes, so we'll give everybody time to stretch and things. Sure appreciate it. It was very informative.
Thank y'all, appreciate it.
Appreciate it.